Before the Fat Controllers Railway, there were a number of smaller railways dotted around the island of Sodor. One of these was called the Wellsworth and Suddery Railway. Whilst we never see or hear about any of this railway's engines in the Railway series books or the TV series, we know from Audrey's lectures and law books that there were 4 engines on the line. So join me on my quest to draw them all. We know from Audrey's Railways of Sodor lecture that the first 2 engines on the Wellsworth and Suddery Railway were Manning Wardle 060 saddle tanks. People have been asking if I'm going to draw any TV series characters in the Railway series style, and I suppose that this is a good place to start. Technically, Billy and Charlie are based on the Manning Wardle L class, which didn't exist when the Wellsworth and Suddery opened in 1870, but it still felt like too good an opportunity to pass up on. Audrey's lecture suggests that the 2 engines were based on the Q class, but this design also post-dates the railway's opening. Manning Wardle's saddle tank engines all had a similar look to them, but in the end I settled on the K class as a basis. I could have also picked the M class or the old I class, but like I said, they're all pretty similar at the end of the day. In the TV series, Billy and Charlie are orange and purple respectively, but I've gone with the blue livery for the Wellsworth and Suddery. I believe that one of the inspirations for the line was the Kent and East Sussex Railway, which had a deep blue livery, and it sets the railway apart from the Sodor and Mainland Railway, which used a green livery for its engines. The K and ESR used red lining for the engines, but for the W&S I've gone with a white lining. Whilst drawing Billy I'd intended for it to be yellow lining, but the first shade I tried out ended up looking more like white, and I like the look of it. I'm still going with a style reminiscent of the Edwards illustrations for this video, albeit I'm experimenting a bit more with the style. During the last 3 videos I was mainly just using one Railway series book for inspiration, Duke the Lost Engine. In preparation for this video I decided to study the illustrations in all the books drawn by the Edwards, and noticed that their art style was a little different at first. Stepney's book has a somewhat simpler style than their other books, almost like a midpoint between their style they'd eventually go with and John T. Kenny's style. Mountain Engines has hints of that simpler look as well, but certainly by very old engines it seems that the Edwards had settled on their style. I tried to go with the slightly more simplistic look of Gunvor and Peter Edwards' earlier books when drawing Billy. I also wanted to draw his face in a Railway series style whilst still having it look like how it does in the show. I think I found a relatively happy medium. In the show, Billy doesn't like being told what to do. That's basically where his personality ends, so I thought I'd expand upon it. Billy is a stubborn engine, and has a persistent drive for autonomy stemming from being overwhelmed. When others correct him or give him advice, Billy sees this as an obstacle getting in the way of him finishing a job quickly, and as far as he's concerned, the way he was already doing his job is well enough. This can often lead to accidents, such as here where Billy has rammed a truck into a siding, sending metal pipes everywhere. Cue the sound effect. Is this funny yet? I'm sure Billy will find someone or something to pin the blame on for this accident. Don't look at me. It was this stupid truck that did it. When Billy first arrived, he was one of only 2 engines on the railway. So as more engines arrived to ease his workload, he became less overwhelmed. He was still stubborn, however, and would often get shirty if engines younger than he was tried to give him advice. This means that yes, He probably butted heads with Thomas when he arrived on the newly formed Northwestern Railway. And so, here is the finished picture. Billy and Charlie never interacted with each other in the TV series, so I'm thinking that Charlie could be a foil of sorts to Billy. Whilst Billy is stubborn and grouchy, Charlie is a bit of a screwball and often likes to wind Billy up. Sometimes this backfires, and Billy won't trust Charlie even when he's trying to help him. When it came to drawing Charlie, I wanted to do something different from what I did with Billy. I've drawn this image to take place after the formation of the Northwestern Railway, and Charlie is accompanied by Edward. In the TV series, Charlie is the fun engine who likes to tell jokes and doesn't take things too seriously. Charlie could have been the engine who introduced Edward to the railway, and some of Charlie's sense of humour rubbed off on Edward. We like to think of Edward as a wise, kind engine, but I feel as though his cheeky, humorous side often gets overlooked. I'm thinking of the time when Gordon is sulking over having to pull a goods train, and Edward just laughs at him, or when he does the same thing to James after he tells Edward off for being late. There are other instances of Edward's cheeky side that I haven't listed here, but maybe he got that from Charlie. This scene I'm drawing could be Charlie introducing Edward to Wellsworth Station, although thinking about it, Edward probably wouldn't have had the number 2 painted on his tender at that point in the timeline. Engines 1 to 3 of the Wellsworth and Suddery were still in service during 1919, but apparently were in poor condition and withdrawn soon afterwards. But perhaps Charlie was preserved. Maybe he's occasionally put back into service to pull special enthusiast trains, and this illustration depicts a contemporary scene of Charlie arriving at Wellsworth to pick up his special coaches. Edward and Charlie are certainly pleased to see each other. Charlie's eager to hear what's been happening on the railway since last time he was let out, and Edward is looking forward to hearing some new jokes that Charlie has doubtless been thinking up whilst not in service. Whilst this wasn't intentional, looking back at the completed picture I'm kinda reminded of Clive Spong's art style. Possibly it's the angle, since Spong often did draw engines from high angles. I guess it fits in with the idea that this scene could be set in recent times. But with that said and done, here is the completed image. We know what engine number 3 was based on, an 060 tank from the Cornwall Mineral Railway built by Sharp Stewart and Company. When the engine arrived on Sodor, it was soon discovered that they were too heavy for the rails when its tanks and bunker were at full capacity. Thus, the engine had to run with the tanks and bunker half full. I wanted to keep a theme with the naming of the engines. Billy and Charlie both end with the E sound, so in keeping with that theme I've decided to call this engine Wesley. I also wanted to go for a moody, almost gothic atmosphere with this particular illustration. As if to hammer this point home, you may have noticed that I even used the shape of a gothic church window for composition. The vegetation is a lot less lush here than in most of my illustrations so far, with no leaves on the trees and the grass looking pretty anemic. After buckling the rails with their weight, Wesley became very mindful of the track and the surrounding environment. They would always travel slowly and carefully, which sounds like a good idea, but when passengers have places to be, then they're not going to appreciate the gesture. "Oh, hurry up down there. We've got places to be, we need to get to work." No, No, I must be careful, I simply must. Wesley's perfectionist nature persisted. They couldn't just walk it off, or chuff it off in their case. Their problem needed addressing, and an addressing is eventually what they got. When they were sent back to Sharp Stewart, which by this point was part of the North British Locomotive Works, to have their bunker removed and a tender attached, allowing for better weight distribution. I would have drawn Wesley with their tender, but this didn't happen until 1912, over 30 years after their arrival on the railway, and indeed after the railway had merged with the Tidmouth, Knapford and Elsbridge Railway. So this illustration is a more typical Wellsworth and Suddery Railway scene. I've depicted Wesley pulling a four-wheel coach, not based on anything in particular, although I believe the Metropolitan Railway had coaches of a similar-ish design. With all that said, here is the complete illustration. Now we're heading into the unknown. We know that there was a fourth engine on the Wellsworth and Suddery Railway, and that it was an 060 tank engine, but we know nothing else about it. Whilst working on this video, I used the book The Brill Tramway, including the railway from Aylesbury to Verney Junction, as inspiration. This book contained a lot of photos of Manning Wardle tanks working on light railways, which is very appropriate for this video. The book also contains a lot of photos of Metropolitan Railway A classes on rural branch lines, and I nearly considered basing number 4 on one of these. But other than the fact that these engines are not 060 tanks, I find it unlikely that the Wellsworth and Suddery's tracks would have been strong enough for this sort of engine. Ultimately, I decided to base number 4 on a Robert Stevenson and Company locomotive, similar to number 2309 Haydock. I wanted number 4 to be an engine with side tanks and no rear coal bunker for one simple reason. This illustration from Dirty Objects. There's an engine coupled to the breakdown train that is probably just a badly drawn Thomas, but I like to think it's a separate engine, and since the illustration takes place at Wellsworth, I like the idea of it being an ex-W&SR engine. So here's Betty, the railway's number 4. Betty was a happy little engine who was always glad to be alive and steaming. This demeanour of hers didn't win the hearts of Billy or Wesley, whom were overall much more cynical engines. However, she became much more popular with the two of them once they realised that they could palm off the jobs they didn't want to Betty, who was always happy to do any work she was given. Some of the railway staff warned Betty to be cautious, but she didn't understand what the problem was. She just thought that Billy and Wesley were being nice to her. The manager of the railway soon caught on to what was happening when he noticed that Betty's trains were getting longer and longer every day, and so he spoke severely to Billy and Wesley. Betty was still insistent that she could cope with the workload, but the two haughty engines were made to do their fair share of the work. They grumbled about it, but soon stopped when Charlie called them weaklings. Betty went on to work the line for many decades, in later years helping Edward to run his branch line, which is what the Wellsworth and Suddery eventually became. She'd also take the breakdown gang to clear up accidents, and help to bank engines up Gordon's Hill when Edward was busy with other things. If I'm sticking with my idea of the Alsborough branch line engines being the original numbers 7 to 9, Betty could have become the original number 10. It's unknown when she was withdrawn from service, but it would have to have been before or during 1959 when Donald and Douglas arrived and Douglas acquired the number 10. I've drawn Betty leaving Suddery with a train of vans. In the distance we can see Suddery Cathedral. I used Ely Cathedral as inspiration. As far as I understand, this is a bit big for Suddery, although I like the idea of a tiny city having a massive great cathedral. And here, is the finished drawing. And there we are, all 4 engines of the Wellsworth and Suddery Railway illustrated and interpreted by me. It's certainly been an interesting ride and probably the biggest challenge so far, but I think it paid off in the end. Let me know what you think by commenting down below, and don't forget to subscribe.